The parade ground at Fort Leavenworth baked under July sun in 1866, dust rising from boot heels as 200 black men stood in formation, wearing Union blue for the first time as peacetime soldiers. White officers clustered in shade near headquarters, arms crossed, placing bets on how long these former slaves would last before deserting or collapsing under real military discipline. They gave it 6 weeks. The regiments would last over 80 years. This is the story of how America armed the people it had just freed, sent them to die in the worst conditions imaginable, and watched in rage and confusion as they became legends. The ink on the 13th Amendment, barely dry. Congress authorized 6 all-black regiments in July 1866, consolidated within months into 4 units that would reshape American military history: the 9th and 10th Cavalry, the 24th and 25th Infantry. White officers commanded them because the Army refused to commission black men above the rank of sergeant. The posts assigned to these Buffalo Soldiers, as the Plains tribes would name them, were the ones white troops refused: West Texas scrubland, Arizona deserts, Montana winters that turned fingers black with frostbite. Before we ride deeper into this contradictory legacy of valor and betrayal, drop a comment below. Where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? And if stories like this matter to you, hit that subscribe button, because what follows has been buried under sanitized textbook versions for over a century. The Fort Leavenworth quartermaster issued the 10th Cavalry equipment that white regiments had condemned as unfit for service: rifles that misfired, horses too old or too green, boots that split after a week's march. The logic was simple and cruel. Black soldiers didn't deserve better. And besides, they'd fail anyway. Colonel Benjamin Grierson, appointed to command the 10th, despite requesting a white regiment, wrote to his wife in August 1866, "I have been assigned to lead Africans. I requested this duty exactly, never." Yet something unexpected crystallized in those first brutal months. Men who'd survived slavery understood suffering as a baseline, not a breaking point. They drilled until movements became muscle memory. They maintained weapons white troops would have discarded. They marched distances that emptied canteens and split lips, then marched further. By September, desertion rates among the Buffalo Soldiers sat at 1.6%, the lowest in the entire U.S. Army, where white cavalry units bled men at nearly 10% monthly. The reality unfolding on Western plains terrified a specific slice of white America more than any battlefield defeat: black men in federal uniforms, armed and disciplined, protecting white settlers and mail routes, answering to military law instead of slave codes. Every successful patrol was proof against the mythology that had justified 2 centuries of bondage. Every medal earned demolished the lie of inherent inferiority. Lieutenant Henry Flipper, the first black graduate of West Point in 1877, wrote in his private journal, "They hate us not despite our competence, but because of it. Our excellence is their nightmare made visible." The 9th Cavalry deployed to Texas in 1867, tasked with securing 900 miles of frontier against Comanche raids, Mexican revolutionaries, and white outlaws who saw black soldiers as targets rather than authorities. At Horsehead Crossing on the Pecos River, Sergeant Emanuel Stantz led a patrol of 9 Buffalo Soldiers against a Kickapoo raiding party that had stolen horses from a settler family. Outnumbered more than 2 to 1, Stantz charged uphill into rifle fire, recovered the stolen animals, and returned without losing a single man. He became the first black soldier to receive the Medal of Honor in the Indian Wars. The medal ceremony happened without journalists present. No photographs survive. Official recognition delivered in shadows. But in black communities across America, the news traveled through churches, newspapers, and letters read aloud in kitchens. Freedmen who'd been whipped for learning to read now saw their sons wearing sergeant's stripes. Mothers who'd watched children sold at auction saw their boys riding across the front pages of black-owned newspapers, rifles gleaming, spines straight. The Buffalo Soldiers became more than military units. They became evidence. What would you do if your competence was treated as provocation? If every success you earned intensified the danger around you? The worst posts, the broken equipment, the officers who saw them as experiments or embarrassments, none of it stopped the Buffalo Soldiers from becoming the most decorated cavalry units in frontier history. But decoration and respect proved different currencies, and the country that armed them was about to demand they enforce its darkest contradictions in ways that would test their loyalty to breaking. The plains stretched endless under August heat, and somewhere in that vastness, native warriors, who would soon call them worthy opponents, watched blue-coated riders approach their territories, recognizing in these black soldiers something their white commanders could not. Men who understood what it meant to fight for a nation that had never fought for them. Fort Davis sat like a scar on the Trans-Pecos Desert, stone buildings radiating heat that turned metal buckles into branding irons by noon. The smell of creosote and dust mixed with horse sweat, while boots crunched across caliche so hard it rang like bone. When Companies D and F of the 25th Infantry arrived in August 1867, the post commander refused to shake their captain's hand. The Western frontier wasn't just geography. It was a laboratory where America tested whether black men could be trusted with violence and authority. Captain Nicholas Nolan, an Irish immigrant who'd earned his commission during the Civil War, led the first extended patrol of the 10th Cavalry's Company A into the Staked Plains of West Texas in July 1877. His orders: locate and engage Comanche raiders who'd been hitting supply trains. His reality: 110-degree heat, limited water, and equipment that kept failing. 24 hours into the patrol, canteens ran dry. 48 hours in, horses started dropping. By the third day, men were drinking horse blood to survive. What the official reports never emphasized: Nolan was white. Every enlisted man on that patrol was black. And when dehydration and sun exposure turned Nolan delirious, it was Sergeant William Umbles who took command, rationed the remaining water by spoon, and navigated 86 miles back to base using stars and intuition. 4 men died. 40 would have died without Umbles. The Army promoted Nolan. Umbles got nothing written in his service record. But stories traveled through different channels. Black newspapers from Kansas City to Boston ran accounts of the Staked Plains horror, emphasizing not the deaths, but the survival. The Christian Recorder published an editorial in September 1877. While white officers collapsed, black sergeants became compasses. Remember this when they tell you we lack capacity for leadership. The contradiction lived in every patrol report. Buffalo Soldiers were simultaneously dismissed as inferior and feared as threats, too incompetent to deserve proper equipment, too dangerous to allow into white neighborhoods when on leave. Army regulations forbade black soldiers from entering saloons in frontier towns, yet these same towns demanded military protection that only Buffalo Soldiers could provide. At Fort Concho in 1878, Corporal Isaiah Mays of the 24th Infantry walked into a San Angelo saloon after being refused service at 3 others. The bartender pulled a shotgun. Mays didn't draw his service revolver. He was off duty and knew the consequences for a black soldier shooting a white civilian. Instead, he disarmed the man with his bare hands, walked out, and reported to his commanding officer. The bartender filed charges. Mays was court-martialed for creating a disturbance. He received 60 days hard labor. The bartender received apologies from the post commander. Every mission completed, every medal earned, every life saved. The 9th Cavalry deployed to New Mexico Territory in 1876, assigned to hunt down cattle rustlers and protect mail routes through Apache territory. Lieutenant John Conline wrote to his sister in Philadelphia, These colored troops ride harder, shoot straighter, and complain less than any white company I've commanded. I admit this with embarrassment at my previous assumptions. Such admissions rarely made official records, but the statistics did. Between 1866 and 1890, Buffalo Soldier regiments recorded the lowest desertion rates, highest re-enlistment rates, and most citations for bravery in the entire U.S. Army. The 10th Cavalry alone earned 8 Medals of Honor in the Indian Wars. The 24th Infantry never lost a regimental flag to enemy capture, a point of pride so fierce that soldiers who'd served would mention it decades later in pension applications and obituaries. Native warriors gave them the name Buffalo Soldiers, for reasons debated even now. Some historians claim it referenced their hair. Others suggest it honored their fighting spirit, comparing them to the buffalo tough, resilient, impossible to break. The Comanche, Cheyenne, and Apache didn't fight the Buffalo Soldiers any less fiercely than they fought white troops. But multiple tribal accounts describe them differently, as men who fought without the settlers' casual cruelty, who honored truces, who buried enemy dead with respect. Captain Charles Cooper of the 10th Cavalry recorded a parley with a Cheyenne war leader near Fort Sill in 1874. Through interpreters, the warrior said, "You fight for the same people who enslaved you. Why?" Cooper's response, noted in his journal, "I had no answer that satisfied him or myself." The question would only grow sharper. Would you fight excellently for a nation that fought your humanity at every turn? Would you protect settlers who spit when you rode past? The Army kept sending them to the worst posts with the worst equipment, and the Buffalo Soldiers kept turning impossible orders into completed missions, impossible terrain into mapped territory, impossible odds into victories that made white commanders quietly furious. Because every success was a refutation, every medal was evidence, every survival was proof. But excellence has never protected Black Americans from betrayal. And the greatest betrayal was approaching not from enemy warriors on open plains, but from a white hero in the White House, who would disgrace an entire battalion to protect his own legacy. The desert nights dropped 40 degrees, turning sweat-soaked uniforms into ice. Somewhere in that cold, Buffalo Soldiers stood watch, proving themselves to a country that would never stop demanding proof. Sergeant Emmanuel Stantz stood at attention in the Fort McKavett commander's office on May 20, 1870, sweat darkening the collar of his dress uniform despite the morning cool. The smell of leather and gun oil hung in the still air, mingling with cigar smoke that curled from the major's desk. Outside, cavalry boots scraped parade ground dirt in rhythms Stantz could identify by sound alone. Company F, running close order drill. The Medal of Honor ceremony lasted 4 minutes, witnessed by 3 officers who stayed silent throughout. Stantz had earned America's highest military decoration by leading 9 men against 30 Kickapoo raiders, recovering stolen livestock and returning without casualties. The citation praised his gallantry in action and distinguished conduct. What it didn't mention, he disobeyed a white lieutenant's order to retreat, correctly assessing that withdrawal would mean abandoning settlers to certain death. The lieutenant had filed a complaint. The complaint was quietly withdrawn when the settlers testified that Stantz had saved their lives. The medal went into Stantz's footlocker. He never wore it on duty. Wearing it, other sergeants had learned, made you a target not from enemies, but from white soldiers who saw decorated black troops as violations of natural order. By 1871, 18 Buffalo Soldiers had received the Medal of Honor. None received promotion beyond sergeant. Most received harassment that ranged from missing pay vouchers to deliberate assignment to the most dangerous patrols. Sergeant Thomas Boyne of the 9th Cavalry earned his medal at Los Animas Canyon in September 1879, then spent the next 3 years repeatedly passed over for positions he'd earned through merit and seniority. Excellence wasn't armor. Often, it was a sentence. The town of San Angelo, Texas, maintained separate entrances for Buffalo Soldiers, at the post-sutler's store around back, near where trash was burned. In 1877, when Private Henry Johnson of the 25th Infantry used the front door, 4 white cavalrymen beat him unconscious with axe handles. The investigation concluded Johnson had provoked the altercation by forgetting his place. The white soldiers received verbal reprimands. Johnson lost 3 teeth and partial vision in his left eye. Observers didn't just enable this violence, they gathered to watch it, forming crowds outside saloons when Buffalo soldiers were refused service, cheering when fists flew. Town councils in frontier settlements petitioned the army to station white troops instead, citing concerns about social disruption. The disruption they feared wasn't crime. Buffalo soldier units had the lowest rates of civilian complaints in the army. The disruption was the sight of armed black men in positions of authority. What would you have done? Standing in that crowd, watched in silence, walked away, or joined the cheering? The 9th Cavalry, deployed to the Texas Panhandle in 1874, tasked with protecting survey teams mapping railroad routes through Comanche territory. Captain Francis Dodge wrote in his official report, "The men performed admirably under conditions that would break lesser soldiers." In his private letters, he was more explicit. They are treated as subhuman by the very settlers they protect. Yesterday, a woman threw dishwater at Corporal Brown as he rode past. He said nothing, did nothing, maintained discipline. I lack words for the control that requires. That control was survival mathematics. One Buffalo soldier striking a white civilian meant courts-martial, imprisonment, or worse. One white civilian striking a Buffalo soldier meant, at most, a fine, usually nothing. The Uniform Code of Military Justice applied unevenly, its protections extended or withdrawn based on skin color. Lieutenant Henry Flipper discovered this when he arrived at Fort Davis in 1878, the first black officer in the regular army. White officers refused to dine with him. Their wives refused to acknowledge his presence. When commissary funds went missing, embezzled by a white quartermaster, Flipper was charged, tried, and dishonorably discharged, despite evidence clearing him. The actual thief was quietly transferred and kept his rank. From the Atlanta Constitution, June 16, 1881. The Flipper case proves what many have long suspected, that Negroes, even educated ones, lack the moral character for officer duties. His dismissal, though unfortunate for him personally, protects the integrity of our armed forces. The integrity being protected was white supremacy wearing epaulets. Meanwhile, on patrol in Arizona Territory, Buffalo soldiers were establishing survival records that would stand for decades. The 24th Infantry marched through 120-degree heat in August 1882. Full packs, maintaining formation for 16 hours straight to reach a water source before it evaporated. White cavalry units attempting the same route had turned back after 8 hours. The difference wasn't physical conditioning, it was institutional. White troops knew they'd receive support if missions proved too difficult. Buffalo soldiers knew they'd receive blame, so they didn't fail. Sergeant George Jordan of the 9th Cavalry held Fort Tularosa, New Mexico, against Apache warriors led by Victorio in May 1880, with just 25 men against estimated forces of 100. The siege lasted 3 days. Jordan rotated his troops in shifts so thin that some men slept standing up, propped against walls with rifles loaded. When relief finally arrived, the fort hadn't lost an inch of ground. Jordan received the Medal of Honor. The citation praised his fearless exposure to the enemy during the entire engagement. What it called fearless exposure, Jordan called Tuesday. Could you maintain that discipline knowing your excellence would be minimized, your failures magnified, your very presence treated as provocation? By 1885, the contradiction had sharpened to a blade's edge. Buffalo soldiers were protecting the same frontier expansion that destroyed native peoples, enforcing the same federal authority that had once hunted fugitive slaves. serving a nation that debated their humanity in newspapers and Congress. Some resigned. Most stayed. Not because the Army treated them fairly, it didn't, but because the uniform, for all its failures, offered something slavery never had: the right to fight back, even if that fight came in forms they'd never imagined, even if it meant confronting their own complicity in conquest, even if the greatest betrayal still waited ahead, wearing a Rough Rider's hat and a president's smile. The parade grounds emptied at dusk, boot prints filling with purple shadow. Somewhere in those shadows, men who'd proven themselves repeatedly, prepared to prove themselves again, knowing proof would never be enough, knowing they'd do it anyway. Some say Sergeant Stantz was murdered in 1887, shot in unclear circumstances that were never properly investigated. His Medal of Honor was found in his footlocker, still wrapped in the cloth from the day he'd received it. 17 years of polish and pride contained in fabric that had never seen daylight. Yosemite Valley echoed with the crack of axe on timber. In summer 1899, the sound bouncing off granite walls that had witnessed millennia before white men arrived with surveying equipment and grand plans. Pine sap sweetened air, already thick with meadow grass and snowmelt, while tent canvas snapped an afternoon breeze that carried the smell of campfire coffee. Captain Charles Young, of the 9th Cavalry, watched his troops clear illegal logging operations with the precision they'd once used to clear Apache ambush positions. The Buffalo Soldiers became America's first park rangers, though history barely remembers them in that role. Congress had established Yosemite and Sequoia as national parks in 1890, then immediately faced a problem: no funding for protection. Poachers decimated wildlife populations. Illegal logging operations stripped ancient groves. Squatters built permanent structures on federal land, daring anyone to evict them. The solution arrived in the form of troops the Army could spare, meaning troops white commanders didn't want cluttering up prestigious posts. The 9th Cavalry and 24th Infantry received orders to protect parks nobody else would. They built the first trail system in Yosemite, constructed the original wagon roads that would become modern highways, established patrol patterns and fire prevention protocols still used today. Captain Young, the third black graduate of West Point, personally mapped remote sections of Sequoia while leading the first successful ascent of the peak that now bears his name, though it wouldn't be named for him until decades after his death in 1922. The work was nation-building, disguised as punishment duty, and the Buffalo Soldiers treated it with the same excellence that had defined their frontier service. Civilian accounts from Yosemite visitors in 1900 reveal the cognitive dissonance of the era. A Mrs. Adelaide Johnson from Boston wrote in her diary, "We encountered Negro soldiers on patrol near Sentinel Rock. I confess initial alarm at seeing armed colored men in such remote wilderness. Yet their bearing was impeccable, their assistance invaluable when our wagon wheel broke. My husband noted they executed repairs with greater skill than any mechanic in Boston. I am forced to revise certain assumptions. Those assumptions died slowly, violently, incompletely." Private William Cathy of the 24th Infantry spent his off-duty hours in Sequoia studying the giant trees, measuring circumferences, estimating ages based on growth rings in fallen specimens. His notes, discovered in park archives in 1976, contained observations that predated formal dendrochronology studies by 2 decades. He received no credit during his lifetime. His name appears on no plaques. What happens when your contributions are erased as systematically as you execute them? The Park Service wasn't the only arena where Buffalo Soldiers proved their versatility. In 1898, when war with Spain erupted over Cuba, the 9th and 10th Cavalry deployed to the southeast for tropical training. White regiments bound for the same conflict received priority for transport ships, medical supplies, and modern weaponry. Buffalo Soldiers made do with Civil War-era Springfield rifles while white units carried new Krag Jorgensens with superior range and firepower. At Las Guasimas, Cuba, on June 24, 1898, the 10th Cavalry rescued Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders from a Spanish ambush that would have slaughtered the entire volunteer regiment. Sergeant George Berry carried the American flag forward under withering fire. After the white regimental color guard fell, 5 Buffalo soldiers died, covering the Rough Riders' retreat. Roosevelt's after-action report mentioned their assistance in a single subordinate clause. His autobiography, published years later, barely mentioned them at all, but the black press documented everything. The Richmond Planet ran a front-page illustration in July 1898 showing Buffalo soldiers charging up San Juan Hill, which they did, alongside Roosevelt's men, absorbing casualties to take fortified Spanish positions. The headline read, "They fought like veterans because they were veterans." Roosevelt received a Medal of Honor nomination that would be approved in 2001 posthumously after a century of lobbying. The Buffalo soldiers who saved his unit received what they always received: silence, punctuated by occasional acknowledgement when politically convenient. The Spanish-American War proved something white military leadership had tried to deny for 3 decades. Black troops could fight conventional warfare as effectively as they'd fought frontier campaigns. They could handle tropical diseases, navigate foreign terrain, execute complex maneuvers under fire. The evidence was overwhelming and systematically ignored. Lieutenant John J. Pershing, who'd commanded Buffalo soldiers in multiple campaigns, earned the nickname Black Jack, meant as an insult by white officers who saw his association with black troops as career contamination. He wore the nickname as honor and would later command all American forces in World War I, carrying lessons learned from the men who'd made him a better officer. Some debts get acknowledged, most don't. In 1900, fresh from Cuba, the 25th Infantry deployed to the Philippines to suppress the independence movement. The contradiction sharpened to its finest point. Black soldiers, recently freed from bondage themselves, ordered to suppress another people's freedom struggle. Filipino insurgents distributed leaflets specifically targeting Buffalo soldiers, asking why they fought for American imperialism when America denied them basic rights at home. Some deserted, most didn't. The reasons were complex, as identity itself: loyalty to brothers in arms, belief in military honor, pragmatic understanding that desertion meant death, either by court-martial or in hostile jungle. And perhaps something else: the recognition that their fight for respect had always required operating within systems designed to exclude them, turning those systems' own standards against them. Could you enforce occupation knowing your own people lived under a different kind of occupation back home? Would principles or pragmatism guide you? Captain William T. Anderson of the 10th Cavalry wrote to his wife in 1901, "We fight enemies who look at us with confusion and ask questions we cannot answer. We fight for a nation that questions our right to fight." Somewhere in this contradiction lies a truth I cannot name, but feel in every order I give. The park's work continued, even as foreign wars expanded. Buffalo soldiers rotated between Yosemite summers and Philippine campaigns, between building America's natural heritage and enforcing its imperial ambitions. The disconnect was a chasm that each man navigated alone, knowing that excellence in either role would be minimized, while failures would be amplified beyond recognition. They maintained the trails anyway. They fought the wars anyway. They carried the contradiction with the same discipline they carried everything else, because the greatest test still waited, not in foreign jungles or granite valleys, but in a Texas town where an entire battalion would be sacrificed to protect white power, ordered by a president they'd saved from Spanish bullets. The betrayal was coming, and it would carry Roosevelt's signature. The Yosemite twilight turned granite gold, shadows filling valleys where Buffalo soldiers camped after clearing another illegal operation. They say if you hike certain trails at dawn, you can still find evidence of their work: stone foundations, carved initials, the geometric precision of men who built to last, even when they knew history wouldn't remember them building. Midnight gunfire ripped through Brownsville, Texas on August 13, 1906. Muzzle flashes, strobing adobe walls along Elizabeth Street, while spent cartridges rang on cobblestones like scattered coins. The acrid smell of burned powder mixed with the Gulf humidity that made everything stick shirts to skin, fear to memory, lies to official reports. By dawn, one bartender lay dead, a police lieutenant wounded, and an entire battalion of the 25th Infantry stood accused of a massacre they didn't commit. This was the Brownsville Affair, the moment when Theodore Roosevelt proved that black loyalty meant nothing against white political convenience. Companies B, C, and D of the 25th had arrived at Fort Brown in late July, replacing white troops who'd been stationed there without incident. The town's white residents immediately petitioned for their removal, citing unspecified concerns. Translation: they didn't want armed black soldiers near their homes, their businesses, their daughters. The Buffalo Soldiers, as always, maintained discipline. They patronized only businesses that served them, avoided confrontation, kept a base, except when duty required. It didn't matter. Brownsville had decided they were guilty before any crime occurred. The shooting started around midnight on August 14th. Witnesses reported seeing 8 to 12 shooters moving through town, firing into buildings, targeting specific addresses. Physical evidence at the scene included spent shell casings from Springfield rifles, the same model issued to the 25th Infantry. Mayor Frederick Combe immediately declared the soldiers responsible. No investigation, no evidence beyond the casings, just certainty, wrapped in prejudice. Major Charles Penrose, the battalion's white commander, conducted an immediate inspection. Every rifle accounted for, every soldier accounted for. None showed evidence of recent firing, no heat residue, no powder burns, no missing ammunition from inventories that were checked and rechecked. Multiple soldiers had witnesses placing them in barracks at the time of the shooting. The evidence suggested a frame-up so obvious that even local newspapers questioned the accusations. Roosevelt didn't care about evidence. The president faced a midterm election where Southern white votes mattered more than black soldiers' lives. When the Inspector General's investigation failed to identify specific perpetrators because none existed among the accused, Roosevelt issued an ultimatum. The soldiers must identify the shooters among them, or the entire battalion would be dishonorably discharged, without trial, without pension, without honor. What would you do, knowing you were innocent, but that innocence wouldn't save you? Would you invent names to satisfy power? Or would you maintain truth, knowing it meant destruction? The soldiers refused to confess to crimes they hadn't committed. They refused to accuse brothers who'd done nothing wrong. On November 5, 1906, Roosevelt signed the discharge orders. 167 men, including 6 Medal of Honor recipients, were expelled from military service without court-martial, without due process, without the presumption of innocence that supposedly defined American justice. Sergeant Mingo Sanders had served 26 years, 2 years from a full pension. Discharged. Corporal Willie Brown had earned commendations in Cuba and the Philippines. Discharged. Private James Howard was 19 years old, in uniform 8 months. Discharged. All of them branded as mutineers, stripped of benefits, barred from federal employment for life. Their service records marked with dishonor they hadn't earned. And Roosevelt, the same man whose life they'd saved at Las Guasimas 8 years earlier, never wavered in his certainty of their guilt. From the New York Times, November 7, 1906. President Roosevelt's decisive action in the Brownsville matter demonstrates the firm hand necessary in maintaining military discipline. That entire companies must suffer for the silence of the guilty is unfortunate, but necessary. The guilty were white vigilantes who'd staged the shooting to drive Buffalo soldiers from the region. This would be proven decades later through testimony, ballistics analysis, and historical investigation. But in 1906, proof mattered less than narrative. And the narrative demanded black soldiers be guilty because white Texans insisted they were. The black community erupted. Protests filled churches from Boston to Los Angeles. The Niagara Movement, precursor to the NAACP, made the Brownsville Affair a central cause. Ida B. Wells wrote, "Roosevelt has taught us that loyalty without whiteness is worthless. Our sons wore the uniform, bled for the flag, and were discarded like garbage the moment it became politically convenient. But political convenience prevailed. Congress held hearings in 1907. Senator Joseph Foraker of Ohio championed the soldiers' cause, presenting evidence of the frame-up so comprehensive that even Roosevelt's allies struggled to defend the decision. It didn't matter. The discharges stood. The president's reputation remained intact, and 167 men learned that excellence, valor, and sacrifice could be erased with a signature. Some found work as laborers, starting over in their 40s and 50s without the pensions they'd earned. Some descended into poverty so complete that former Medal of Honor recipients died in county poorhouses. Some simply disappeared from records, erased by despair or deliberate obscurity. The country they'd served forgot them systematically. Would your service survive that betrayal? Would your belief in justice outlast its denial? Private Dorsey Willis, discharged at age 23, spent the rest of his life fighting for exoneration. He wrote letters to every president, from Roosevelt to Eisenhower, detailing his whereabouts on the night in question, providing witnesses, demanding review. He died in 1958, 74 years old, dishonorably discharged, still stamped on his record. His letters were found after his death in a trunk that also contained his uniform, pressed and preserved as if he might need it again. The Brownsville Affair accomplished what frontier warfare, disease, and hostile settlers couldn't. It broke trust between black soldiers and the military institution. Re-enlistment rates among Buffalo soldier regiments plummeted. Black communities stopped celebrating military service with the same pride. The uniform had been revealed as conditional protection, honored when convenient, stripped away when politically useful. Yet some stayed. Some re-enlisted, even after Brownsville. Not because the system had earned their loyalty, but because leaving would feel like surrender. And Buffalo soldiers, trained by decades of impossible conditions, didn't surrender easily. The 25th Infantry reformed with new recruits, shipped to Hawaii, then to the Philippines again. The 9th and 10th Cavalry continued patrolling the border, protecting settlers who saw them as threats, building parks for visitors who wouldn't acknowledge their contributions. They carried on, because carrying on was the only resistance available to them. But something had broken. The myth that excellence would be rewarded, that service would be honored, that America might eventually recognize their humanity. Brownsville shattered those illusions completely. What remained was grimmer knowledge. They served not because the nation deserved it, but because they deserved to prove themselves regardless of recognition. The contradiction would follow them across oceans, into the next war, where their competence would again be questioned, their loyalty tested, their excellence documented and dismissed. The pattern was old by now, but so was their resistance. The Elizabeth Street cobblestones still exist in Brownsville, buried under decades of repaving. They say on certain August nights, if you listen carefully near the old fort grounds, you can hear phantom gunfire and the silence that followed. Not the silence of guilt, but the silence of men who refused to lie, even when lies would have saved them. 167 men choosing honor over survival, knowing survival was forfeit either way. The Philippine jungle pressed in like wet wool on March 10th, 1901, vines dripping with humidity that turned leather to mold and metal to rust within days. The smell of rotting vegetation mixed with gunpowder residue, and something worse, the aftermath of village burnings that nobody would document in official reports. Sergeant David Fagan of the 24th Infantry stood at a crossroads that thousands of Buffalo soldiers would face: continue enforcing American occupation or desert to fight alongside the people whose freedom struggle mirrored their own. The Philippine-American War forced Buffalo soldiers to confront the darkest contradiction of their service, becoming the oppressors they'd fought to escape. The conflict had started in 1898, when America, having liberated the Philippines from Spain, decided liberation meant American rule rather than Filipino independence. Emilio Aguinaldo's revolutionary forces, who'd been fighting Spanish colonialism for years, discovered their new enemy wore the same flag that had supposedly freed them. By 1900, the war had descended into brutal counterinsurgency. Villages burned for suspected rebel support. Civilians concentrated into camps. Water torture employed to extract information. Buffalo soldiers participated in all of it, not because they believed in the mission, but because military discipline demanded obedience. The dissonance was crushing. Filipino insurgents recognized it immediately. They distributed leaflets specifically addressed to Black American soldiers, written in English that cut straight to the wound. You are sent to kill brown people who have done you no harm, by white people who deny you basic rights at home. Why do you fight us instead of them? The question hung in the jungle air like gun smoke that wouldn't clear. Private William Sims of the 9th Cavalry wrote to his sister in Alabama in January 1901. The natives here call us Black Yankees, but with sadness, not anger. They ask why we serve masters who treat us as they treat these islands, as property to be exploited. I have no answer that satisfies my own conscience. Some soldiers found answers in desertion. At least 30 Buffalo soldiers, possibly more, defected to the Filipino side during the war. David Fagan became the most famous or infamous, depending on perspective. He joined Aguinaldo's forces in November 1900, quickly rose to captain in the Revolutionary Army, and spent 2 years leading successful guerrilla operations against American troops. His former comrades hunted him through the same jungles where he'd once hunted insurgents. The Army offered rewards for his capture: $500, then $600. Not dead or alive, the posters specified alive, because making an example required a public execution. Fagan was never captured. Reports claimed he was killed in 1901, but his body was never confirmed. Some say he lived out his days in the mountains, training Filipino fighters until independence finally came decades later. Most Buffalo soldiers didn't desert. They stayed and followed orders that violated everything they'd fought for at home: the right to self-determination, freedom from arbitrary violence, dignity under law. They became what they'd resisted: armed enforcers of oppression. Captain Matthew Steele, a white officer commanding Buffalo soldier units in Samar Province, wrote in his diary in March 1902, "My men execute orders with precision but without enthusiasm. They burn villages when commanded, but take no satisfaction in it. They understand too well what it means to have your home destroyed by uniformed men claiming authority." The violence escalated. General Jacob Smith's infamous order to turn Samar into a howling wilderness applied to all American forces, including Buffalo soldiers. Villages suspected of supporting insurgents were razed. Males over 10 years old were designated combatants subject to execution. The water cure forcing prisoners to swallow gallons of water until their stomachs distended, then beating the water out, became routine interrogation practice. Buffalo soldiers watched. Some participated. All were complicit by uniform and proximity. What would you do, knowing refusal meant court-martial and possibly execution? Would you follow orders that replicated the violence enacted against your own people, or would you desert, knowing you'd be hunted as a traitor? The 9th Cavalry engaged in a firefight near Balangiga in October 1901 after insurgents had killed 48 American soldiers in a surprise attack. The retribution was systematic. Surrounding villages burned, livestock slaughtered, food stores destroyed, to starve out rebel support. Sergeant John Calloway recorded in his personal journal, "We are ordered to create the conditions that were created against us in the South-scorched earth, collective punishment, terror, to break resistance. I understand the mission. I cannot reconcile the mission with the man I believed I was becoming." The cognitive dissonance fractured unit cohesion. Arguments erupted in barracks between those who defended following orders and those who questioned the entire enterprise. Some soldiers clung to the belief that military discipline transcended moral judgment. Others saw collaboration with imperialism as betrayal of their own history. Both groups suffered. Neither was wrong. The war officially ended in 1902 with American victory, though fighting continued for years in isolated regions. Buffalo soldiers returned home, having proven their competence in conventional warfare and counterinsurgency. They demonstrated the ability to adapt tactics, endure tropical diseases white troops couldn't handle, and maintain discipline under the worst conditions imaginable. Their reward was continued segregation, denial of promotions, and systematic erasure from official histories that credited white officers for victories Buffalo soldiers had won. Nothing had changed except the location of their exploitation, but something else had shifted internal to the soldiers themselves. The men who returned from the Philippines carried knowledge that couldn't be unlearned. Excellence within an unjust system doesn't redeem the system. It makes you complicit. The uniform they'd worn with pride revealed itself as a tool that could be turned toward any purpose, honorable or horrific, depending on who gave orders. Some soldiers quietly left the military after their enlistments ended. Others stayed, but with eyes open to the reality that patriotism and justice were separate concepts, sometimes aligned, often opposed. They'd served America's imperial ambitions while America continued denying their citizenship rights. The contradiction was complete, and waiting ahead was another world war, another chance to prove themselves, another betrayal already being written in the segregated training camps and Jim Crow policies that would define their service even as they fought fascism abroad. The pattern repeated because the pattern was the point black excellence utilized and discarded in cycles as predictable as seasons. The jungle never forgets. They say in remote Philippine villages, elders still tell stories of black American soldiers who fought with tears in their eyes, following orders they hated, caught between loyalty and conscience in ways that made them dangerous to both sides. Some stories mention the ones who stayed, who melted into the population and helped build the independence they'd been sent to destroy. Those stories might be legend, or they might be the only truth that survived. Camp Funston, Kansas, shivered under January sleet in 1918, ice coating the parade ground where the 92nd Division's all-black infantry regiments drilled in worn uniforms waiting for transport to France. The smell of coal smoke from barrack stoves mixed with wet canvas, and the particular dampness of men who'd been training in substandard conditions for months. White officers watched from heated buildings, debating whether these troops would embarrass America abroad or prove useful as labor battalions. World War I offered Buffalo soldiers another chance to prove themselves, and another lesson in how proof changes nothing. When America entered the war in April 1917, over 400,000 black men registered for the draft. Military leadership immediately faced a crisis of ideology. They needed the manpower, but couldn't stomach the implications of armed, trained black soldiers returning home with combat experience and expectations of equal treatment. The solution was familiar segregation, inferior equipment, and assignment to support roles instead of combat units. The 92nd and 93rd Infantry Divisions formed as all-black combat units, but with white officers commanding at every level above captain. Black officers who'd earned commissions through officer training were systematically denied command positions, shunted to supply roles, or discharged on fabricated grounds. The message was explicit. Black men could die for America, but not lead Americans. Yet when the 93rd Division deployed to France, something unexpected happened. The French army, desperate for troops and operating under different racial assumptions, integrated the division's regiments into French command. The 369th Infantry Regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters, spent 191 days in combat, longer than any other American unit. They earned the Croix de Guerre, France's highest military honor. French officers praised their courage, skill, and discipline. American command was furious. General Robert Bullard issued secret orders to French military headquarters in August 1918, later published in the Chicago Defender. We must prevent the rise of any pronounced degree of intimacy between French officers and black officers. We must not eat with them, must not shake hands with them, seek to talk to them, or to meet with them outside the requirements of military service. We must not commend too highly these troops, especially in front of white Americans. The directive continued with explicit instructions that black soldiers not be praised where white American troops could hear it, that French civilians be discouraged from treating black soldiers as equals, and that any fraternization between French women and black soldiers be reported as a disciplinary matter. France largely ignored these orders. The Hellfighters returned home as decorated heroes in French eyes. In American eyes, they returned as a problem requiring management. What happens when you fight excellently for a nation that demands your excellence remain invisible? The 92nd Division faced different treatment. Assigned to American command, they were given outdated equipment, inadequate artillery support, and sent into the Meuse-Argonne offensive with minimal preparation. When some units faltered under conditions that would have broken any green troops, white officers used the performance as evidence of inherent black inferiority, despite those same officers having systematically undermined the division's readiness. Private Burton Holmes of the 368th Infantry wrote to his family in October 1918, "They set us up to fail, then blamed us for failing. When we succeed, despite sabotage, they find ways to minimize our success. There is no winning this game because the rules exist to ensure we lose." Still, individual acts of valor forced their way into records. Corporal Freddie Stowers led his company in assault on German positions in the Champagne-Marne sector on September 28, 1918. Machine gun fire cut down half his unit in the first minutes. Stowers, already wounded, continued advancing, rallying troops, taking objective after objective, until German bullets finally killed him while capturing a fourth machine gun nest. His commanding officer recommended him for the Medal of Honor. The recommendation was lost in processing. Stowers received his medal in 1991, 73 years after his death, presented to his surviving relatives when he had no surviving relatives who'd known him alive. The pattern of delayed recognition, posthumous honor, and systematic erasure continued. Henry Johnson of the Harlem Hellfighters single-handedly fought off a German raiding party of over 20 soldiers while wounded, saved his fellow soldier, and became the first American to receive the Croix de Guerre. He returned home to a segregated nation that offered him no benefits, no employment opportunities, and no recognition of his service. He died penniless in 1929, age 32, from injuries sustained in combat that the Veterans Administration refused to properly treat. His Medal of Honor came in 2015, 86 years late. The war ended in November 1918. Black soldiers returned expecting the double victory over fascism abroad and racism at home that black newspapers had been promoting. Instead, they returned to the Red Summer of 1919, when white mobs attacked black communities across America, often specifically targeting veterans whose military bearing and refusal to show deference were seen as threatening. In Elaine, Arkansas, white mobs killed over 200 black residents in October 1919, many of them returning veterans. In Chicago, a race riot in July killed 38 and left over 500 injured. In Washington, D.C., white sailors and Marines hunted black residents for 4 days while police watched or participated. The targets were often men still in uniform, whose service overseas had made them expect dignity at home. Could you return from war and accept that nothing had changed? That your sacrifice had been utilized but not honored? That the fascism you'd fought abroad thrived unchallenged in your own country? The military drew exactly the wrong lessons from World War I. Instead of recognizing black soldiers' competence under proper conditions, leadership concluded that integration was disruptive and that black units required especially harsh discipline and limited opportunities. These conclusions would shape policy through World War II and beyond, creating self-fulfilling prophecies where inadequate support produced subpar results that were then blamed on racial inferiority. But black communities drew different lessons. The Harlem Renaissance exploded partly from the confidence of men who'd proven themselves in Europe and refused to accept American limitations anymore. The Great Migration accelerated as Southern black families fled toward northern cities, where veterans organized, agitated, and demanded recognition. The seeds of the modern civil rights movement germinated in the contradiction between wartime service and peacetime oppression. The Buffalo Soldiers regiments were deactivated through the 1920s and 30s, their proud histories archived and forgotten. The 9th and 10th Cavalry became mechanized units, then were disbanded entirely. The 24th and 25th Infantry merged, shrank, and finally disappeared from active rosters. The black men who'd built America's parks, fought its frontier wars, saved Teddy Roosevelt, and earned foreign military honors were systematically erased from the narrative of American military excellence. But erasure isn't the same as absence. The legacy lived in the soldiers who'd served, in the communities that celebrated them, in the expectation they'd created that black excellence couldn't be permanently denied. That legacy would survive to the next war, the next generation, the next opportunity to prove what shouldn't require proving. The camp at Funston emptied by 1919, its barracks repurposed, its parade grounds silent. But in Chicago, New York, Atlanta, and Los Angeles, black veterans gathered in churches and meeting halls. Swapping stories that official histories omitted, they remembered. And remembering, they taught their children that the uniform had never been the point. The point was the man inside it, and what he chose to do when America demanded everything and offered nothing. They say in France, small villages still maintain memorials to black American soldiers who liberated them in 1918, whose names appear on no American monuments. The French remember what America chose to forget, that valor has no color except the red of blood spilled in soil that doesn't distinguish between those who die for it. The Buffalo Soldier Monument at Fort Leavenworth stands 9 feet tall in bronze, erected in 1992, 126 years after the first regiments formed. Rain darkens the metal to near black, pooling around the base where plaques list battles fought, medals earned, and promises broken. The smell of wet grass and Missouri River clay hangs in the air, while Wind Through Cottonwoods provides the only ceremony most days when tourists don't visit. The memorial came a century too late to honor the men it depicts, but legacy has always moved slowly for those who built it in defiance of recognition. By World War II, the Buffalo Soldier regiments had been officially disbanded, their traditions absorbed into segregated units that would fight another war under the same conditions. Excellence demanded, equality denied. The 92nd Infantry Division reformed for service in Italy, where they faced German positions in the Apennine Mountains while simultaneously fighting American command structures that expected them to fail. Some units performed heroically, others struggled under impossible conditions. All were judged more harshly than white units facing similar challenges. The pattern held until Korea, where integration finally came not from moral awakening but military necessity. President Truman's executive order desegregating the armed forces in 1948 wasn't implemented until battlefield casualties forced commanders to use whatever troops they had, regardless of color. Integration happened because segregation became logistically inefficient, not because it was recognized as morally indefensible. The Buffalo Soldiers' legacy became what they'd always known it would be: utilized when convenient, acknowledged when unavoidable, celebrated only after every man who'd served was safely dead and unable to complicate the narrative with messy truth. But what they built survives in unexpected places. Every black officer in today's military stands on foundation stones laid by men who weren't allowed to be officers. Every integrated unit operates under protocols developed through hard lessons the Buffalo Soldiers learned while being systematically undermined. Every military doctrine about maintaining discipline under hostile conditions, every survival manual about operating in extreme environments, all contain knowledge purchased with Buffalo Soldier blood and preserved, despite institutional efforts to erase their contributions. The parks they built still welcome millions of visitors annually. Yosemite's trail system, Sequoia's roads, the fire prevention protocols that protect California's forests all bear invisible fingerprints of men whose names appear on no ranger station plaques. Captain Charles Young's maps guided development that would continue for a century, though his name was only added to the peak he climbed in 2013, 91 years after his death. What does it mean to build a nation that refuses to acknowledge you built it? The 9th and 10th Cavalry's combat records remain among the most distinguished in U.S. military history. Lowest desertion rates, highest reenlistment rates, multiple medals of honor, decades of frontier service that opened the West to settlement that benefited everyone except those who'd made it possible. They fought with distinction in every American conflict, from the Indian Wars through World War II, and in return received segregation, discrimination, and systematic denial of benefits earned through service. In 2005, the military conducted an investigation into the Brownsville Affair, 99 years after it occurred. The findings confirmed what had been known from the beginning. The soldiers were innocent, framed by white vigilantes, sacrificed by Roosevelt for political convenience. The discharges were officially reversed. Citations for bravery were finally entered into records. By then, every man involved was dead. Justice delayed a century. Is justice performed for cameras, not for those it was denied? Dory Willis, who'd spent his life fighting for exoneration, had died 47 years before vindication arrived. His letters to presidents, detailed and desperate, never received substantive responses during his lifetime. After his death, they were archived and forgotten until researchers discovered them while investigating the affair. Reading them now is an exercise in witnessing systematic denial, a man presenting irrefutable evidence of innocence, ignored for decades because acknowledging his innocence would require acknowledging systemic injustice. Could you maintain hope across 50 years of rejection? Could you keep fighting for truth that everyone already knew but refused to acknowledge? The contradiction the Buffalo Soldiers embodied never resolved. It just became less visible as integration made all black units obsolete. They proved that black soldiers could fight as well as white soldiers, which led to integration, which made their specific legacy harder to trace. Their success erased the conditions that had made them distinct, and in erasing those conditions, made it easier to erase their contributions. But in black communities, the memory persisted in different forms. Grandfathers told stories about uncles who'd served in the 10th Cavalry. Church histories preserved letters from parishioners stationed at Fort Davis. Family Bibles contained pressed flowers from Yosemite, sent home by sons who'd built trails through granite and prejudice. The official histories might omit them, but the lived histories carried their legacy forward in private archives that mattered more than bronze plaques erected for tourist consumption. The final Buffalo Soldier, Mark Matthews, died in September 2005 at age 111. He'd enlisted in the 10th Cavalry in 1936, serving just as the regiment transitioned from horses to mechanization, catching the tail end of an era already passing into legend. At his funeral, he received full military honors, the first time some of the gathered dignitaries had seriously considered what Buffalo Soldiers represented beyond historical footnote. Matthews had spent his later years speaking to schools about his service, trying to ensure the legacy wouldn't completely vanish. He described the pride of wearing the uniform, the pain of serving a nation that didn't serve you back, and the complicated truth that both emotions could be simultaneously true. "We knew we were making it better for those who'd come after," he said in a 2003 interview. "Didn't always make it easier, but it made it mean something. What they made meant everything and nothing. Everything to the communities that celebrated them, to the children who saw Black excellence in uniform and believed they could embody it too, to the slow grinding change that eventually forced America to recognize Black military competence. Nothing to the institutional structures that utilized their service while denying their humanity, that awarded medals posthumously when they couldn't be presented to living soldiers who might demand equal treatment as consequence. The final irony: the Buffalo Soldiers became America's conscience without ever being treated as America's equals. Their excellence was the argument that finally forced integration, but only after every possible alternative had been exhausted. They were the proof that couldn't be ignored, which is why so much effort went into ignoring them. Today, military recruiting materials feature their legacy prominently brave Black soldiers who served with distinction, opening doors for future generations. The materials omit Brownsville, the systemic discrimination, the betrayals, the reality that they served excellently despite their treatment, not because of it. The sanitized version is easier to recruit with. The truth is harder to reconcile with national mythology. The monument at Fort Leavenworth collects leaves in autumn, ice in winter, tourists in summer. It stands as testament to men who knew they were building legacies they'd never see honored, who served anyway because the alternative was surrender. Their silence wasn't acceptance, it was strategy. Survive long enough, prove conclusively enough, and eventually the evidence overwhelms even the most determined denial. They were right, eventually. It just took longer than any of them lived to see. Some say if you visit Fort Leavenworth at dawn, when morning mist rolls off the Missouri River, you can see shadows moving in formation near the old parade grounds, men drilling with the precision that defined their service, maintaining standards no one else could see but everyone would eventually have to acknowledge. The shadows don't speak, don't demand recognition. They just keep drilling, perfect in execution, because perfection was the only argument they were ever allowed to make. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.